All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the recording of discussion 3. This will be 3 out of 12, so we're making some progress. My laptop charger broke this weekend, and my office, my apartment was closed for Labor Day, so I will be recording this entire video on my iPad, so sorry if there's any weird volume issues. I think I got it all set up, and we should be solid. So let's go ahead and hop on into it. I think I'm gonna have to stop my video because I'm going to be sharing my iPad screen and you'll just see me writing. So let me get this going. All right, screen share, start broadcast, 3, 2, 1. All right, awesome. So we're going to hop right on into this. So for today's discussion, we are going to be looking at hormones and hypothalamic control. So we're going to be looking at the hypothalamus, this area in the brain that will release hormones to the anterior pituitary gland, which will release into an endocrine gland and hit a target. As we begin, let's go ahead and map this out. Let's map out this pathway that these hormones are generally traveling along, or I guess I should say always going to be traveling along. So what it looks like is we have some sort of stimulus. Let me screen that, zoom that in. So we will have some sort of stimulus. Whether it's a bee landing on your arm or a bee stinging you, or you touching something hot, or you touching something you like, you getting a massage, some type of stimulus will occur. It doesn't even have to be an external stimulus. It could be an internal stimulus. You're hungry. You need to urinate. You need to drink some water. Your body's telling you you're thirsty. There will be some type of stimulus. And these are always normally going to be sensory stimuli, so some sort of like sensory stimulus. So once we detect that stimulus, it will be sent to the hypothalamus. And again, the hypothalamus is a region of the brain. It's kind of known as the control center. The hypothalamus is also known as our first integration center. So integration center 1. It's where we are going to integrate that stimuli. So after leaving the hypothalamus, we're going to enter into the anterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland, or just the anterior pituitary. And what technically is happening is that hypothalamus is going to release a hormone, hormone 1. And it's going to send that hormone to our second integration center, and integration center 2, which is the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is going to send our second hormone, our hormone 2, to the endocrine gland, whichever endocrine gland we are specifically looking at. So that second hormone sent to the endocrine gland, and then that endocrine gland is going to send the third hormone to some target cell in the body. So what we see is that hormone 1 and hormone 2 are both known as tropic or trophic hormones, meaning they're going to signal the release of another hormone. So hormone 1 is going to signal the release of hormone 2. Hormone 2 will signal the release of hormone 3. So it looks something like that. However, hormone 3 works a little bit differently. Hormone 3 works through negative feedback. So through negative feedback, hormone 3 will kind of come over here and inversely affect hormone 1. So what we're going to see is anytime we have a high level of hormone 3, we're normally going to have a low level of hormone 1. We're going to kind of shut down hormone 1. Anytime we have a low level of hormone 3, we're going to see the opposite. We're going to see a ramp up in the production of hormone 1. We'll start producing a lot more to compensate for that underproduction of hormone 3. So that is kind of how this all works. This is that pathway of the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. And that's just kind of a general overview. So before we begin our first technical problem, where we're going to be looking at some applicatory questions, some patients, I wanted to go over just some general facts about hormones and these pathways, because I think it will really help us understand and be able to solve these next two easier. So if you want to go to a blank piece of paper, I highly recommend taking note of this. Y'all did hit this in lecture, so this might be a little bit of review to you, but you can never review too much for this class. So let's begin. So what we're going to be looking at is 4 different hormones, their pathways of travel, and the different hormones that are released to release that final hormone. So we're going to have cortisol, thyroid hormone, growth hormone, which I'm going to abbreviate as GH, and our sex hormones. So I am now going to go through kind of the pathway we just discussed. So we will receive some type of stimulus, and the first integration center that's going to detect it is that hypothalamus. So that hypothalamus detects that stimulus. It's going to release a hormone to the anterior pituitary. So we see that with all of our different hormones. The hypothalamus will sense a stimuli. It'll release a hormone to our second integrative center, the anterior pituitary. Same here, hypothalamus detects, releases to the anterior pituitary. And last but not least, detects stimuli, sends it to second integration center, or integration center number 2. So we have now drawn out that pathway. However, that's not where they normally end. So with cortisol, what we're going to see is that anterior pituitary is going to release some type of hormone to the adrenal cortex. Adrenal cortex, which is an area of the adrenal gland, which will further release, and we'll look at that in just a second. And then for our thyroid, of course, the anterior pituitary is going to release a hormone to the thyroid, or the thyroid gland, which will send it off. And then the growth hormone, it's actually going to stop here, and I'll discuss why in just a little bit. But lastly, our sex hormones, the second integration center will send that last trophic hormone to the gonads. So now that we've kind of labeled out our pathways, let's go ahead and start putting some hormones on this. So what we're going to see is our hormones kind of have this cascading effect. One's going to be released, which will stimulate another one, which will stimulate another one. So let's go ahead and break down these specifics. So what we see for cortisol is the hypothalamus is going to release CRH, cortico-releasing hormone, and so the integrative center 1, the hypothalamus is going to release that cortico-releasing hormone. The cortico-releasing hormone is then going to stimulate the anterior pituitary to release ACTH, the adrenocorticotropic hormone. Big words, adrenocorticotropic hormone. Can't even talk. So that anterior pituitary will release that hormone 2, and hormone 2 is going to cause the release of hormone 3, which we see comes from the adrenal cortex, specifically cortisol, which is, fun fact, our stress hormone. So the adrenal glands will release cortisol, which will normally stimulate some type of adrenal or adrenaline response. All right, nice. So whenever we look at the thyroid, we're going to see that the integrative center 1, the hypothalamus, is going to release TRH, thyroid releasing hormone, which will stimulate the anterior pituitary gland, or the anterior pituitary, to release TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, which will cause the thyroid to release thyroid hormone T3 or T4. With the growth hormone, what we're going to see is the hypothalamus is going to sense that stimuli and release GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone. The release of growth hormone release hormone will stimulate the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. So why we don't kind of show that next pathway is because growth hormone has so many functions in the body. So here we're just going to kind of consider that the final hormone in the pathway, just because we could send it to so many other locations. All right, and lastly, we have our sex hormones. So our integrative center 1 is going to detect a stimuli and release GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. That will stimulate the anterior pituitary to release FSH or LH. And that release of FSH and LH will cause the gonads to release our sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen. All right, great. So now that we have what did I do? Estrogen. So now that we have this kind of just general overview, it's a nice little map to help us solve these next couple questions. So let's go ahead and hop on into it. So question number 2 is looking at 3 different patients, Colin, Sam, and Barbara, and looking at what's going on. They're having some type of disorder, and it's up to us to use this data to determine what exactly is happening. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with Colin. So I'll go through Colin, and then I want y'all to try to work through Sam and Barbara on your own and then come back to check. So what we see is we have Colin, and how we're going to work these problems is going to be looking something like this. We're going to have our hormones, TRH, TSH, and T4, thyroid hormone. So this is going to be kind of our work. This is how we're gonna design these problems to begin working through them. So let's see what's going on with Colin. Colin has some rare hypersecreting hypothalamic tumor. Big word, but let's break it down. So what we see is that a hypersecreting hypothalamic tumor is going to be affecting that hypothalamus hormone. What is our hypothalamic hormone when we're looking at the thyroid? That's going to be TRH. So that's TRH. And we know that because if we look down here, we see our hypothalamic hormone for the thyroid is TRH, the hypothalamic hormone. So if we're having a hypersecreting tumor that's dealing with the hypothalamus, that's going to be looking at TRH. And what this really means, if we consider that hypersecreting section, it's going to mean an increased production of TRH. So we see this increased production of TRH. So with that, we can kind of start working through our data. So we can start off by drawing some arrows. So step 1 is going to be drawing our arrows. So we know that we have high levels of TRH. And if you remember, TRH is a tropic hormone. And anytime you see tropic, that means it's going to signal the release of a following hormone. So if we're having high secretions of TRH and it's a tropic hormone, that means we're going to be having high secretions of TSH. High secretions of TSH, one of our tropic hormones, is going to cause a high release of T4, our thyroid hormone. Remember that we're going to have that negative feedback loop, and that T4 is going to kind of come back up and stimulate the hypothalamic hormone, which is TRH. So now that we've drawn out our arrows, now we're going to kind of look at our data. So let's go ahead and look at our data set. So We see we have high levels of TRH. So we're going to look here, and our normal levels are 10 to 40. So we have two high levels here. We have high levels of TSH as well. So 5 to 50, that's going to mean these two are considered high. And then we're going to have high levels of T4, thyroid hormone. So 1 to 3, these two are going to be our data sets. So which data set fits Colin? Trick question. None of them do. None of them line up completely. So Colin is a rare case. So before we begin on the next one, I just wanted to add a little bit extra onto this question because it'll help you on your exam. But what we're also going to be looking at is the pathology of what's going on. So we're going to be looking at either primary or secondary pathology. So what that kind of looks like is we can draw this line here. And anything above the line is going to be secondary pathology, and anything below the line is going to be primary pathology. I know that's weird. I know you would think the first two would be primary and the second two, or the last one would be secondary, but it's flipped because primary pathology is looking at that effect on the final hormone in the pathway. So primary pathology is looking at the effects of the final hormone in the pathway compared to secondary pathology, which is looking at the effect on the tropic hormones. So the tropic hormones, again, are those hormones that signal the release of another hormone, not through negative feedback. Negative feedback is not a signal, it's a mechanism. So now we're gonna kind of have to determine where we're seeing an issue. So where is this issue coming? If we have high levels of T4, what we would expect is high levels of T4. What we would expect is a response of, lower levels of TRH. So anytime we have high levels of T4, that negative feedback loop would the hypothalamus would detect, hey, we're making a lot of thyroid hormone. Let's kind of slow down the release of thyroid releasing hormone because we want to slow down the production of that overproduction of thyroid hormone we have going. So what we see is that this is not an appropriate response. Increasing the amount of thyroid releasing hormone is only going to continue that hypersecretion of the thyroid hormone T4. So that is an inappropriate response. However, we can follow it up or finish it up to make sure nothing else is going wrong. TRH is stimulating TSH, that would be increased because it is tropic, so that is okay. Because yes, if the thyroid releasing hormone was increased secretion, we would also see an increased secretion with TSH. TSH is again another one of the tropic hormones, so we would expect an increase in thyroid hormone or T4. So where our problem lies is here with this increase in thyroid releasing hormone, because that's causing that hypersecretion, which is causing that hypothalamic tumor. So since it's above our line, that's going to mean it is a secondary pathology or a secondary hypersecretion. So a secondary pathology form of hypersecretion. All right, great. So we have now knocked out Colin. So now we have Sam and Barbara. So I'll give you two little hints before you try and knock them out on your own. I would highly suggest working through that to make sure you know how to do it on the exam. But before we begin, I kind of can give you all two little hints. So with Sam, what we see is that he has an iodine deficiency resulting in low production of thyroid hormone. So he has this low production of thyroid hormone. So what that means is a low secretion or production of T4, our thyroid hormone. With Barbara, we will see, let me draw her needle, Barbara. What we see is that she has Graves' disease. Graves' disease is an autoimmune disease where antibodies are produced that completely mimic TSH. So if they're mimicking TSH, we can go back to this chart. and look at our TSH right here. So if our antibodies are mimicking it, what we're going to see is, that increased production of T4. So we see that mimicking of TSH, which is causing that increased production of T4, thyroid hormone. All right, great. So y'all go ahead and pause the video, try and work this out, and then we will return and check the work. Alrighty, welcome back. So again, we can kind of start off with our basic design for working through these problems. So we have our thyroid releasing hormone, our thyroid stimulating hormone, and our thyroid hormone. Again, following that pathway of the first integrative center, the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, the integrative center 2, and then our actual organ or gland. So let's start knocking it out. So we have Sam, who has that low production of thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone is the last in the pathway, so we'll see that negative feedback reaction, which will cause an increase in thyroid releasing hormone. Our thyroid releasing hormone is a trophic hormone, so it will follow that same pathway, and we will have an increase in thyroid stimulating hormone. So with this, we can look at our data and decide which set it most closely matches. So we see an increased level of thyroid releasing hormone. So here and here, we see an increased level of thyroid stimulating hormone here and here. And we see a decreased release or level of thyroid hormone T4. So we're gonna see that here and here. So looking across, Sam is going to match data set A. Now we can kind of look at the specifics of what's going on, where this pathology disease is occurring. So we can draw out our line and start working on through. So thyroid releasing hormone, if it is stimulated, if we are seeing high levels of thyroid releasing hormone, we're going to have that cascading effect, meaning that we will have high levels of, oops, did not mean to draw the arrow out. But if we see an, increased production of thyroid releasing hormone, we're also going to see an increased release of thyroid stimulating hormone. So those arrows check out. And with that, thyroid stimulating hormone is one of our tropic hormones. So we would expect an increase in thyroid hormone or T4. However, we see it is decreased. So this is where our error lies. This is what is the problem. Because again, thyroid stimulating hormone is a tropic hormone. So if it's being produced, if we're seeing high levels of that, we should also be seeing high levels of thyroid hormone. That should also be being produced as well. But here it is being, it's being underproduced. We're seeing a low production of it. So that's where our error lies. Just to finish out checking, making sure nothing else is wrong. If we're having low levels of thyroid hormone, our last one in the pathway, through that negative feedback, do we see the hypothalamus compensating for that underproduction? Yes, we see an increased production of thyroid releasing hormone, which is showing us that the hypothalamus is making up for that decrease or that underproduction of thyroid hormone. So this is also correct or appropriate. So here we see that our problem is going to be secondary. Specifically, it's going to be secondary hyposecretion, because we're not producing enough. All right, great. And then finishing up with Barbara, last time to work through this design, we have our thyroid releasing hormone, which causes the release of thyroid stimulating hormone, which causes the release of thyroid hormone T4. So again, Barbara has Graves' disease. That means that we are having antibodies that are mimicking TSH. TSH is going to be increased because we need, TSH to produce thyroid hormone. So what we see is that if we have an increased, if we have an increased level of TSH, if we have an increased level of T4, we're going to have that negative feedback loop, which is going to cause that decrease in TRH, because if we're making a lot of thyroid hormone, our hypothalamus will detect, hey, we're making a lot of that. Let's slow down the thyroid releasing hormone because we don't need to release this cascade because we're already producing it. So that's going to be a decrease in thyroid releasing hormone. Thyroid releasing hormone is a tropic hormone, so it's going to cause the same for TSH. We'll also see lower levels of TSH being produced. So with this, we can look at our data set. So low levels of TRH, let's see, low levels are going to be 5 and 4. Low levels of TSH, we're going to see 2 and 1. And then high levels of thyroid hormone, we are going to see this one and this one. So the data set that Barbara is going to be mimicking or resembling is going to be data set B. So now that we've compared the data sets, we can look at the pathology occurring. So draw out our line. So we can start off with TSH. So thyroid releasing hormone is in lower levels. That's tropic. So we're going to expect lower levels of TSH being produced. So that is correct. If we have low production of TSH, one of our tropic hormones, that will cause a low production of thyroid hormone. However, we see some pathology going down there, some inappropriate action. So that's where that's going to occur, because TSH is a tropic hormone. So the action of T4 should mimic it, and that is not occurring. It is acting in the opposite direction. So we see that T4 is the issue. To finish up, just checking, making sure everything else is okay. We can look and see, okay, T4 is in increased production. So that means our hypothalamus should detect that and kind of slow down the production of TRH. And that is exactly what happens. So we are good there as well. So once more, we are below the line, meaning secondary pathology. And this is going to be, again, secondary or secondary hypersecretion. Alrighty, great. If the pathology section of that didn't make too much sense to you, we're going to be looking at it again here with question 3, and I can kind of give you all just a little bit more clarity with the definition. So again, whenever we're talking about primary pathology, which I'll abbreviate as primary pathology, what we're talking about again is some type of effect on the final hormone in the pathway. So that disease, that inappropriate action is going to affect the final hormone in the pathway. Secondary pathology is looking at some type of inappropriate response, some type of pathological response that's going to affect the tropic hormones. So affects the tropic hormones. So it's really good to understand these pathways that we drew down here. These are going to be our tropic hormones, and these are our final pathway hormones. So you definitely want to focus on memorizing these. You should just be able to memorize hypothalamus to anterior pituitary to gland or organ. So make sure you're focusing more heavily on the hormones, the specific hormones, and not just the pathway itself. All right, so the question is asking us, does data set D represent a primary or secondary pathology? So we can come back up here and look at data set D, which I'll draw right here. What we see with D is, we can kind of set it up same as before, TSH, oops, did that backwards, TRH, TSH, and T4. So what we're going to see with data set D is going to be, where is it? Low levels, because we're going to be comparing it to normal. So we compare it to normal. So we're going to see a low level of T4. We're going to see a low level of TSH and a high level of TRH. So we're going to see, sorry, lost it. Where did it go? There it is. So what we see is that high release of TRH, low release of TSH, and low release of T4. So again, we can kind of work through this to solve for the pathology. If we are releasing high levels of TRH, we would expect to see high levels of TSH being released, but that is not the case. So we see an inappropriate or pathological response right there. Low levels of TSH should stimulate low production of T4, so that is correct. And then we have our negative feedback loop, which low production of T4 should alert the hypothalamus to start secreting some thyroid releasing hormone so we can produce more T4. So yes, we do want that, that increased production, so that is correct. So our problem lies here with TSH. We can draw our line, and that is going to be affecting our secondary hormone. And I realized right here I made a mistake. I made two mistakes here. Primary, again, is below the line. Primary is below the line. So this should have been primary here and here. So we should have primary hypo and primary hyper. Here we're below or above the line, so we see that secondary. So that is going to be secondary pathology. Alrighty, guys, that's going to be part 1 of this video. I'm going to make a part 2 just to kind of split it up. So go take a bathroom break, go get a snack, some coffee, whatever you want to do in between, and I will see y'all back for part 2.